going around in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, all the art done by women, and bring all those women back to the forefront. And we were honored to see that Simone Leifer has the first black artist from the US to be represented in a pavilion, and with our beloved Cuban Belkis Ayon around the sculpture by Simon Leek. Cecilia was also interested in the relation between the organic, the inorganic, the survival of the planet. Many of the topics that we have discussed throughout this week, we have had recently come out of a pandemic, and we could not be alienated from everything that was going on. It was striking when she was introduced, when I read her CV in the 55th Venice Biennial, that she was the only female or woman curator. The first one was Rosa Martinez from Spain with Martina Corral, Escuria, Christine Marcel, and finally Cecilia. Respecting all the work that curator artists before her made to organize that exhibition from that perspective was an act of justice, and a very radical act indeed. That's why we wanted to invite her. We had Roberto and our team, of the organizing team of the theoretical event. He said, "Don't you know that Cecilia Alemane is the wife of Maximiliano Johnny?" No, I didn't know. She said, "I want to go to Cuba with my husband, but how can I, but you know what is embarrassing? I can pay for her ticket, but I cannot bring her husband. I cannot pay for her husband's ticket." And I thought that was not going to be polite, but Viola helped us, and when we realized that Johnny was her husband, we asked the embassy, "Please help us to make sure that the two of them can come." And they came accompanied by their son, who knows, might be a curator of the Venice Biennial in the future as well, because it is unprecedented and unheard of that a couple have been both curators of the Venice Biennial. And that was no nepotism, that was only due to their talent and prestige. Cecilia is not that she was the woman curator of that exhibition, but the only truly independent curator who has curated the Venice Biennial. She was not a director of any museum or of any division. Maximiliano was a director of a museum, of the new museum, and that's no criticism. I think that's wonderful. And I will read now Cecilia's CV. She studied art. She was a student of Hugo Mesquita. She was in Brazil as a student. Several came to Cuba on several occasions. She has been chief curator of the Fine Art project, which is a very interesting project, which is the railroad line that was recovered. The Chelsea train will in the U.S. The Foundation Donald Mueller. She was also being a director and curator. She was also the curator of the 12th edition of the Mission site in Santa Fe. Artistic director, of course, of the Venice Biennial. She has curated thousands of exhibitions. She was also involved in the Albacer project in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I spoke about Marina Urrutia and the Encyclopedic Palace, but the title of her project was, we have work by Leonora Carrington in our exhibition, which is called The Milk of Dreams, and that was the title she gave to this exhibition, which was a book written by Leonora when she was in Mexico back in the 1950s, and these are fairy tales, stories for her children. She was a very radical woman. She arrived in the United States and had a long relationship with Mark Angs, and she had several experiences, and that book is a true gem. She was persecuted, she was exiled, She was admitted and secluded in psychiatric hospitals. And I think that's a combination, the milk of dreams. None of us, if we are, people look at us closely, none of us are purely sane. We are all mad somehow. So let's long live madness. And I thank you both for joining us and for sharing this time with us.
Hola. Hello. I'm Massimiliano. Thank you so much, Jorge. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. And also a big thanks to the Italian Embassy for having two guests instead of one. I'm come si dice in spagnolo e in inglese, il secondo terzo incomodo. So anyway, thank you, Jorge, for having me anyway. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the exhibition Il Palazzo Enciclopedico, which was the 55th Venice Biennale, which I curated. I always joke when people say I was the youngest artistic director at the time, and now some 12 years later, I can say I have a bright future behind me, and I can focus on my early retirement, hopefully. Actually, retirement maybe is an interesting point of entry in the exhibition, because the gentleman behind me was Maurino Auriti. Can everybody understand in the translation? Am I speaking too fast, or it's okay? Okay. So Marino Auriti was a car mechanic. He was not a traditional or a professional artist. He was born in Italy. He escaped from Italy during fascism and moved to Pennsylvania, and there he opened a car repair shop. And in his free time, he built this project for a giant museum, of which he was so passionate about that he actually requested a patent for it. Actually, in November 16, 1955, so it's almost the anniversary of Maurino Auriti patent request for his imaginary museum, the Encyclopedic Palace. The Encyclopedic Palace was meant to be 13 floors tall and more than 700 meters tall, and in Auriti's plan, it was meant to cover 16 blocks of the city of Washington, D.C. Obviously, it was never built, even though Auriti even tried to raise money. He displayed the building, trying to fundraise to make it into a reality. The idea of this imaginary museum was that it would host, as Auriti say, all the world's knowledge from the wheel to the satellite. So it was the dream, an impossible dream of universal knowledge, and it was a place that was meant to create an image of the world in the shape of a museum. That to me became a very inspiring concept for the exhibition for a series of reasons. First of all, I was very captivated by presenting and calling the Venice Biennale the Encyclopedic Palace after an imaginary museum, because after all, in the very history of the Venice Biennale, since its creation in 1895, the institution had been trying to capture this impossible dream of bringing all the art from supposedly all over the world into one place such as Venice. So the very mission of the Venice Biennale seemed to me as impossible, romantic, and probably also wrong-footed as Maurino Auriti dream of an impossible museum. And secondly, I like to actually think of the biennial more as a temporary museum than as a biennial. I thought when I was working on my biennial that biennial exhibition had become quite similar. They were always very much based on certain ideas of participatory, interactive, spectacular forms of art, and instead I wanted to approach art differently and to look at artworks that were small, that were made in series, that often were life projects and attempts to devote an entire existence to the creation of one single artwork or body of art. Furthermore, Auriti with this idea of this imaginary museum, had invented or had involuntarily questioned any distinction between high art and minor art. So in his museum, as he said, there would be room for everything from the wheel to the satellite, and that encouraged me to think of a biennial where there would be no distinction between high art and minor art, between famous artists and illustrious nobodies, between artworks and common objects. So my biennial was based on what the art historian Hans Belting called an anthropology of image. So the central assumption of my biennial was that there was no distinction between artwork and other objects. I was interested in a sort of radical, or at least that seemed to me at the time, a radical questioning of both the definition of who gets to be called an artist, and second, what gets to be called an artwork. I set out to make this exhibition by opening up myself and the institution to the inclusion of objects that I wasn't even sure if they should qualify as artworks, and that I thought they were deserving not of aesthetic attention, but almost of affective attention. So I thought everything in this biennial should be treated equally. Everything should be treated as a symptom almost of our culture, and be understood beyond the distinction of art, and more as a manifestation of our relationship with images. I thought that in a moment in which, with our cell phones and computers, we are more and more used to be drowned in images and to be drowned in information, I wanted to look at artists and outsider artists or people who love to make images, and through their contribution understand the different relationships to images in our everyday lives. So taking inspiration from Marina Auriti, I thought of the biennial as a temporary museum, a museum where there would be no distinction between art and non-art, and where possibly there would be no distinction also between artist and non-artist. That opened the door to the presence of very unusual characters, one of them being the car mechanic Marina Auriti, and others, like we can look at the next image here. Sorry, I'm going to turn around. I know it's a little rude, but so I can look at the images at the same time because I can't restart your phone. So the exhibition itself, as some of you might know, the Biennale is usually organized in two large spaces. One is called the Central Pavilion, and the other is called the Arsenale, which was the boat factory of Venice. So in the Central Pavilion, which is where traditionally people start the visit to the exhibition, the first room was devoted to Carl Gustav Jung's Red Book. As you know, Carl Gustav Jung was a doctor, and he was a psychiatrist or a founding father of psychoanalysis. Thank you. And in his free time, from 1914 to 1940, he created this strange object called the Red Book. We can look at the next image, which was a manuscript, a hand-painted book that he devoted 13 years of his life to illustrate. It was a book that I thought was particularly endearing and unsettling, because it was a book through which Jung came to terms actually with a moment of weakness, possibly also some people think an incipient bout of depression, or anyway a moment of unsettling in his life that others would have maybe described as the beginning of a clinical case of depression. And for 14 years he illustrated this book, which is a curious book both of medicine and mythology. As you can see, it's wonderfully illustrated, but illustrated also in a style that in 1914, 1915 mixes both symbolist paintings, what today we would call maybe early art brut, or a strange conflation of contemporary art, expressionism, and also medieval references. Now they resemble kind of beautiful stained glasses from churches, but they tell stories that are inspired by hallucinations, by dreams. It's a very mysterious and beautiful object. I chose Jung as the starting point in the Central Pavilion because first of all, he was a doctor. So, the assumption we have usually when it comes to outsider art and non-traditional, non-conventional art is that it's made by psychiatric patients. No? We all know from Jean Dubuffet and the whole tradition of art brut that the pathological can be inspiring for art. And I wanted to look elsewhere for a moment and to invite the public to question this notion that the outsider is necessarily pathological. So here we have actually a doctor who supposedly has knowledge about mental illness, and he was behaving pretty much like his patients and making strange artworks that would have been deemed as outsider or as pathological had been seen by other doctors. So with these very strange objects, right from the start, the exhibition questioned the distinctions between who is inside or who is outside. I often use a joke when talking about the Venice Biennale about a mental patient in a psychiatric hospital who gets locked into his cell, and the doctors lock him in, and he starts knocking on the door, and he says, "Are you crazy? You locked yourself outside." Now, this reversal of who is in and who is out was particularly instructive for the conception of the biennial and the inclusion of Gustav Jung in particular. Technology is not my friend today. We'll look maybe at the next images. The exhibition, particularly in the Central Pavilion, looked at what, again, Hans Belting has called interior images, the images we all carry in our head. Now, I think this is an example that actually a great French philosopher, Régis Debray, writes about in his wonderful book, Life and Death of Images. He says, why are there images instead of nothing? He says, why humans, and this is an experience we all make, when we dream in images. Why and how do we carry images in our own mind and our own body? Nowadays we are used to think about media, the cell phone, the TV, the newspaper and so on. Those are media, but we also know very intimately that probably the very first medium of images, the very first locus of images is ourselves. Now we are the medium of images. We are, and you'll see examples, we are possessed by images, and that was one of the underlying themes in the exhibition, particularly in the Central Pavilion. And that I thought was useful and instructive, again, in a moment in which we are colonized by images that are artificial, images that enter our subconscious as pervasive as they are through the presence of social media, of cell phones and cameras, et cetera, et cetera. So the Central Pavilion focused particularly on internal images, the images that are within us, the images we see with our eyes closed, and the images we create to organize our knowledge of the world. So the central room of the Central Pavilion featured more than 100 drawings by Rudolf Steiner, of which you can see in the next slide. Rudolf Steiner was a controversial pedagogue, thinker, according to some people also completely non-scientifically driven, but in his life he gave thousands of lectures, and for his lectures, like today, we make our PowerPoint slides, he made these drawings that he would use to display and explain his ideas. He was a kind of pathological lecturer, and I love to display these objects as evidence of an attempt to explain the world using pictures. The important thing that not many viewers understood was that I was not trying to glorify Rudolf Steiner or Alistair Crowley was in the exhibition and many other unusual figures. The premise of my show was less that the inclusion in the exhibition meant that I believed in the ideas that these artists or thinkers or writers were sharing, but that I was more fascinated by the visual languages they had constructed to express their ideas, and particularly to capture the world in all its multiplicity through images. Other examples of possession by images were the work of, we can look at the next images, the work of Ilma af Klint on the right and the work of Emma Kunz on the left. Ilma af Klint, I'm sure at this point, is a name that is familiar to some of you. She was a painter from Sweden who at the beginning of the 20th century started making, we can look at the next image, abstract pictures. Supposedly her first abstract painting dates from 1907, so it predates the work of Kandinsky, it predates the work of Mondrian, but she's been typically erased from the history of art because mainly she claimed her work was done under the influence of supernatural creatures that told her what to paint. So this idea that, and mind you, both Mondrian and Kandinsky were also very interested in spiritualism and in supernatural forms, but possibly because she was a woman and possibly because she thought she was directed by supernatural creatures, she was completely kicked out of the canon of abstract art, and the history of her rediscovery is somewhat recent and certainly had a big role in this Biennale. Again, I wasn't glorifying the fact that she thought she was possessed by other worldly creatures, but I was more interested again in manifestations of creative acts that try to give form to internal images, to interior images, and to the world of dreams through visual representation. Other examples of similar, we can go to the next. I thought there was a question, but I guess we take questions at the end. I don't know if yours was a question, but. Oh, okay, sorry. We can go to the second and the following image, the next one. So other examples of abstractions that were believed to give shape to abstract concepts in the exhibition included these anonymous tantric paintings from India. So again, a notion of expanded creativity was very central in the exhibition, that included non-professional artists, included anonymous objects. We can go to the next image. These were examples of sculptures that were in the center of the room that you just saw. These are ceramic sculptures by Ron Nagel. He's a Californian artist. He makes these sculptures before falling asleep. He calls them sleep works. And so again, this area between the conscious and unconscious was a recurring theme in the exhibitions. These are also extremely small objects. They are roughly this big, and we can move to the next image. The repetition of individual small objects was very much a visual aspect that defined my biennial, and there was a deliberate choice. I found inspiration when working on the biennial in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and particularly their essays about what they call minor literature. Now, Deleuze and Guattari write about minor literature, and they use particularly the examples of Franz Kafka as a type of literature that escapes grand pronouncements, escapes grand narratives, and actually focus on minor expressions. It's, as typically in the case of Deleuze and Guattari, it's a very confounding notions. It's not clear to me exactly what minor literature means, but it inspired me to think of minor art, both physically as small objects, but also an art that is more focused on small victories, is an art of termites rather than art of grand gestures. And that meant that the whole exhibition was created through the repetition of small individual objects rather than large spectacular gestures. So this is a very unusual object in the sense that it was a collection of paper houses that were made by a gentleman named Peter Fritz. Peter Fritz was an insurance clerk. He was never recognized as an artist. These houses were actually found in the trash by two artists and art lovers who saved them and donated them to a museum. So I loved also how the very definition of artist and artwork was unsettled by these objects. No? Here was something or someone that was doing something that he or she loved in their free time. It was unclear even to them if it was art, and it was rescued literally as an act of love by other people that may or may have not been artists. I thought that was also a very encouraging understanding of art for all of us, no? The notion that we can all be artists. Less in the accomplishment of our knowledge and more in the simple act of loving objects. No? I thought that one of the sub-themes in the exhibition was, and this sounds maybe a little cheesy, that the definition of art goes through actually an act of love rather than an act of proficiency with material. Even though, as you'll see, many objects throughout the exhibition, I was also interested in the knowledge that the outsider or the under-recognized develop. No? I included often the work of non-professional artists in my shows, and every time I'm confronted with those works, I actually question myself how truly uneducated they were. No? I think ultimately Bruce Nauman or Picasso or Peter Fritz are not so different in the act of making. Henri Faucillon spoke about the brain in the hand. No? There is a knowledge in the hand that I don't think is necessarily academically created or constructed. It's a knowledge that is produced by the act of making. It's a knowledge that is in the hand more than in the brain or in the academia. And if I think of that knowledge, I don't think there is such a giant difference between the knowledge of the hand of Peter Fritz and the knowledge of the hand of Pablo Picasso and many others. We can maybe run through a few other. This is the work of Antonio Suarez Londoño, who illustrated actually a few books by Kafka. Again, repetition and kind of life projects were very central in the exhibition. We can go to the next slide. This is the work of Morton Bartlett, another so-called outsider artist who made these sculptures as toys. He kept them under his bed, and they were his imaginary friends, and they were incredibly beautiful and hyper-realistic sculptures that were displayed with the work of Carl Andre in the next image. Well, here is another exceptional example of minor art. It's called Suddenly This Overview. It's hundreds of little sculptures made by Fischler and Weiss. Fischler and Weiss are certainly professional artists, but in this work, they were inspired by minor arts, they were inspired by vernacular sculpture, and they created this giant diorama of hundreds of sculptures that describe very meaningless or meaningful moments in the history of humanity. So you can see in the next picture another view, and we can go to the following one to give you an example of next. Yeah, so these are the sculptures. They are very crude, very clumsily made, and this, for example, depicts the moment after the father and the mother of Albert Einstein conceived their son. Now, the sculptures are very humorous, very silly, almost like jokes taken too literally, and they tell a history of the world through its, I would say, minor moments. They were displayed in a room together with this wonderful painting by Dorothea Tanning that we can look at here, called The Truth About Little Girls and Comets. In this work, in the previous work, you might recognize a type of fascination with the word of kitsch, the word of bad taste. I think it was very important in my biennial, and that could be used against me. I always say that I'm interested, I paraphrase the words of the Swiss artist Thomas Hirschhorn. I say energy yes, quality no. Now, when it comes to art, I'm more interested in objects that are charged rather than objects that are traditionally beautiful. And I often think that taste is simply a form of control over people. Taste is the residue of somebody else's aesthetic experience that gets imposed on other people. So many of the objects in the exhibition question traditional notions of quality and taste and some assumed hierarchies of quality. So, now Dorothea Tanning is very much recognized, also part of a general rediscovery and reappreciation for women surrealists, but certainly, if compared to the work of other canonical figures, even 12 years ago, this could have been considered quite dangerously sweet and saccharine, and I was actually, for those reasons, that I was attracted to this work. We can go to the next image. I don't know how I'm doing with time. I'm at 24 minutes. Collecting, as I said earlier, was a very crucial.
Esta es una estrategia muy crucial en la mayoría de los objetos que exhibe. Este es el trabajo de Chin Rodake, ya vieron los trabajos de Peter Fritz. Yo busco artistas o amantes del arte que acumularon grandes objetos o gran cantidad de objetos. Chiro dedicó su vida a hacer estas obras, ahora tiene más de 100, son como collage. En la próxima imagen podremos ver una famosa colección de piedras del escritor realista o para surrealista, que fue una figura muy importante en Francia en los años 30 del siglo pasado, en el contexto del Colegio de Sociología y la Asociación creada por Georges Pacan. También fue enviado a Argentina y trajo mucha literatura sudamericana a Francia y tradujo a Borges y lo presentó en Francia y lo publicó por primera vez en francés. Durante toda su vida coleccionó piedras bellísimas, como pueden imaginar. Mi interés en arte, él estaba interesado en arte no creado por humanos. Escribió libros sobre mariposas, le fascinaba cómo la naturaleza también hace arte, cómo el pulpo cambia o cómo la mariposa los colores de la mariposa y cómo se transforma de gusano en mariposa. Y le interesaba mucho el concepto de la creatividad expansiva que no se centra en la creación humana. Él pensaba que había formas de creación que eran más importantes que las que realizaban los humanos, y por eso dedicó su vida a recopilar piedras, y nosotros tuvimos la oportunidad de exhibir su colección en la Bienal. Esta es una figura que no era un artista, pero a través del arte de coleccionar objetos abrió una nueva comprensión de lo que es el arte y nuestra relación con el arte. Se exhibió también con unos dibujos de un artista chino que murió poco antes de la exhibición. Hizo estos dibujos para curarse de cáncer. Ella consideraba que el arte tenía un poder de curación, y a mí me encanta esta creencia romántica del arte más allá de los supuestos científicos. Estos son dibujos, esto es un grupo religioso en los Estados Unidos que casi se ha extinguido porque creen en el celibato y por tanto no tienen relaciones, no se reproducen. Ellos creen que los dioses hacen regalos a través de los dibujos. Esto es hecho por un artista no profesional que es capaz de dibujar también porque está guiado por Dios. Este es otro ejemplo de objetos realizados y guiados por criaturas sobrenaturales. Este es también un dibujo de Snyder, jugando con el buen gusto, el mal gusto, el arte popular. La siguiente. Ana Semankova, otro.
Started making art late in her life. I think it's also beautiful in many of these biographies, no? And that's also something that intersects maybe with Cecilia's biennial. Often women artists discover, quote unquote, art late in their life as a process of both self-affirmation and self-discovery, no? And it was a process that bypassed the traditional notions of gender and order, and often the fact that the work was dictated by supernatural power gave them an outlet for their creativity that would have not been accepted in traditional academic settings. So that's the work of Anna Zemankova. We can go to the next image. This is Marisa Merz, who was given the life achievement, and this is a work, particularly the center one, that she titled "To see with your eyes closed is to see better," and I thought that was a central question in the exhibition. We can maybe skip through a few images. This is Katie Wilkes. Maria Lasnik, another Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement. She made this body awareness painting. She would paint the parts of her body that she felt like when she was painting. So it was a form of painting as self-discovery of the body. The next one is Lynette Yadon-Boyake. And this was the last room with the work of Richard Serra. Those were two monuments to Pier Paolo Pasolini, who himself devoted his life to a quest for truth, and surrounded by an encyclopedia of seascapes by Thierry de Cordier. We now go to the Arsenale, and I'll try to guide you through the Arsenale very quickly. The Arsenale is an incredibly long and large building. Imagine at its height, the Arsenale was as big as 1/3 of the city of Venice. It was such a spectacular, strange place that it even appears in Dante's Inferno, where Dante compares the fires in the Arsenale to the fire of hell. It was a place that was basically the largest factory in the world for a few centuries, and as such, it was also considered a factory of the marvelous. And so the fact that the Biennial chose the Arsenale as its place always struck me as very symbolic and very beautiful. And so in my choreography for the Arsenale, I thought of organizing the exhibition as a progression from the natural to the artificial, which was the way in which Wunderkammer were traditionally constructed in the 16th century and later, with the assumption that somehow the associative logic of the Wunderkammer was very productive in our world today, where we inhabit a sort of digital Wunderkammer through the associative logic of mass media. On the other hand, so I kind of build the exhibition as this progression. On the other hand, I try to neutralize the Arsenale through the help of an architect whose name is Annabel Seldorf. So the idea was to transform the Arsenale very much into a temporary museum, into a kind of ethnographic museum. Paradoxically, I took the ethnographic museum as a model for the exhibition because I thought it was more productive than the model of the Biennial. I thought the model of the Biennial had somehow exhausted itself, and that we should look elsewhere to create an exhibition. So this is the first room with Marino Auriti Encyclopedic Palace, and it was surrounded by the work of Ojekere. We can go to the next image, who is a photographer from Nigeria. At the time he was still alive, and he made these beautiful photographs of hairstyles. You can see the next image. So he was making his own encyclopedia of hairstyles, and I thought that was also quite inspiring again, now that through paying attention to objects, behaviors that are typically understood as meaningless or valueless, the artist can teach us to appreciate life more richly. No? So here we had somebody who was treating hairstyle as though they were, the greatest sculptures in the world, and presenting a taxonomy or an imaginary museum of Nigerian hairstyles. And we continue to the next image. There were many sort of morphological similarities now between the hair, and then this is a piece by Roberto Cuoghi. You could almost imagine it as a sculpture inspired by those hair, and around were photographs by Christopher Williams depicting glass models of cellular creatures. We can go to the next one. This was the work by Camille Enrault that won the award for Best Young Artist. It was called Gross Fatigue, so the big labor, the big effort, and it was a history of the world as told through a Google search. No? It was an interesting conflation of ancient mythology and new technology, slightly paranoid in creating connections between ideas and objects and images on the desktop of a computer. We can go to the next image. These on the left and right are the work of Elliot Porter, a photographer, and Edward Spelterini. And in the end is a sculpture by Hans Josephson. Here you can see how throughout the exhibition I was also trying to play with expectations around what a biennial is. Now, the sculpture is a contemporary sculpture, but it resembles an ancient sculpture. So the game was often to frustrate expectations about and definitions of what is contemporary, what gets to be called contemporary, what is historical, what is, again, art and non-art. We can go to the next images. This is a close-up of Elliot Porter, and Spelterini was a ascensionist. He took photographs on hot air balloons, and so he was very much interested in the notion that seeing from above meant seeing better and knowing more. Also, he had this kind of encyclopedic desire to possess the earth from the sky. We can go to the next images. This is again Hans Josephson with Yüksel Arslan in the back. Next, these are the drawings of Yüksel Arslan. Next image. Guzmán Paiva and Philly Barlow. Here you see we're moving from stones and rocks into more organic. We can go to the next. Organic shapes. Behind there was Eugene von Breuchenheim, also an artist who was not recognized as such until he died, and his house was found full of hundreds and hundreds of paintings. And in the front was the work of Jessica Hutchins. We can go to the next image. So here we move from crystals and stones and hairstyles to more cosmic images. So cosmologies were very much a theme throughout the exhibition. We can go to the next. This is a work by Steve McQueen that collected images that Carl Sagan, the astronomer, had prepared to be sent in space to describe the Earth to aliens. So these were objects and images that were believed to collect the image of humanity for an alien audience, and Steve McQueen turned it into a film. We can go to the next image. Speaking of travel, either into space or on Earth, this was the installation by Jan Vo, who brought a colonial church from Vietnam to Venice and displayed it along with this tapestry that came from the Vatican. So this section in the exhibition looked at the way in which dreams themselves can be colonized. Now, there is a small book by Marc Auger called The War of Images, I think it's called, in which the anthropologist Marc Auger speaks about how our unconscious gets colonized by beliefs, ideologies, images, and how artists can actually guide us in a process of emancipation from the colonization of the unconscious. So for Jan Vo, born in Vietnam, the role of the Catholic Church in enforcing colonial ideologies onto the Vietnamese population was particularly important, and so throughout his work he has examined the way in which religion and authority was imposed onto local culture. We can go to the next image, and I'm almost done. This is, speaking of religion, this is Robert Crumb, the famous underground comic artist who illustrated the Bible. And the presentation in Venice featured the entire Bible in comics. It was, I don't remember how many, hundreds and hundreds of pages. So again, you have here a very powerful hierarchical ideological narrative that was translated in the language of comic books by one of the most provocative and irreverent comic artists. He was, again, the project of a lifetime. I don't remember how many years Robert Crumb worked on it, and it was displayed in full in the exhibition, and he surrounded, we can go to the next image, a collection of sculptures by Shinichi Sawada, who is a Japanese autistic artist that lives in a remote area in Japan, where he makes these incredible, small, beautiful sculptures of imaginary creatures. It's a sort of pantheon of, we can go to the next image, a pantheon of imaginary divinities. And again, here we go back to what I was saying earlier, no? The self-taught, the autodidact knowledge is, in my opinion, as complex and rich as that of the professional artist. And when confronted with a work like Shinichi Sawada, one also has to ask himself if the knowledge of art history is also really disconnected from the world of the outsider artist. Now, when you see this work, it's inevitable to think of the work of surrealist artists and the work of many artists, of which somebody who is supposedly completely disconnected from clearly seems aware. And we can keep going. This is speaking again. Arturo Bispo de Rosario was a psychiatric patient in a psychiatric hospital in Rio de Janeiro. We can go to the next image. This is Frédéric Bouabré, another encyclopedic narrative of imaginary languages that he created. Pavel Altamer. We can go to the next. And this was a sort of exhibition within the exhibition curated by Cindy Sherman. It's part of what I call personal museums, and it's interesting, Jorge, you were talking about them yesterday as well. So often in my exhibition, I have invited artists to create temporary museums that reveal their influences. And so in this case, it was Cindy Sherman making a show without her work, but talking about the artists that inspire her. And we can see 2 or 3 more images. Next one again, and the next. And then here was the conclusive part of the Arsenale that was more focused on digital culture. This is the work of Alice Chandler with Wade Guyton behind it. We can go to the next image. Albert Oehlen in the back, the next image. Ryan Trecartin, who is a sort of psychedelic poet of the age of overinformation, and Hito Sterl with a video about surveillance and how to disappear, how to disconnect from digital media. And this was the last room in the Arsenale, which was a piece by Walter De Maria called Apollo's Ecstasy. De Maria has often described these sculptures as computers. They are based on numerological studies. And so here you have a kind of machine-looking object that actually performs no action, but seems to use the title of another work of Walter De Maria, to be a computer that could solve every problem in the world. And this was the last final abstract image in the show. So I'll shut up. I'm 10 minutes past 30 minutes. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Massimiliano. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Jorge, for inviting us and the Italian embassy. I also want to thank my son, who has been very patient, Giacomo.
He's not listening.
He's not listening. I'll try to speak slowly, and I'm sorry I cannot speak in Spanish, but I want to walk you through the exhibition at the Venice Biennale, which I had the honor of curating in 2022, so 2 years ago. I was invited to be the curator of the 59th Venice Biennale in January 2020. And you know what happened then in March, the pandemic began, and so I had a very kind of exciting and complicated beginning. The exhibition was scheduled for 2021, but was then postponed for 1 year. So I'm saying that because the genesis of the exhibition and the specific complex time in which I organized this exhibition have really influenced the structure and the themes and the concepts of the exhibition itself. The title of the show is The Milk of Dreams. The title itself comes from a very lovely book by a surrealist artist called Leonora Carrington. You heard about her just before. She was a surrealist British artist that at the beginning of the Second World War fled Europe and went to Mexico and relocated in Mexico City, where she lived for the rest of her life. In the 1940s and beginning of the 50s, she had two kids, two sons, and apparently she was drawing fabulous stories and kind of magical magical images on the walls of her apartment to entertain her kids. Those stories and those images were then collected in a little booklet many, many years afterwards, and their story of fabulous creatures that are transforming and changing. They become animals, they become weird machines, they create these very magical ecosystems. And I really love the not only the sort of surrealist atmosphere of the book, which of course, surrealism is definitely one of the kind of threads of the exhibition, but I also love that they were conceived for her kids, for children, and the book itself, the stories that she tells that are collected in the book are kind of not necessarily for kids. I remember when I read that to my son, who was just 5 years old, he didn't really love them. They're kind of scary, but they really kind of embodied this idea of metamorphosis and transformation of the human, which were the theme of the exhibition I started to conceive. We can go to the next slide. And this is the entrance of the central pavilion. Next. And here you see Leonora Carrington on the left, the book cover on the middle, and on the right you have one of the original drawings of Carrington. Next. So I wanted to take Leonora Carrington and her stories and these creatures as a companion on a journey of this exhibition that would explore ideas of metamorphosis of the bodies and how the definition of human and what is human have been changing. Next. So I was telling you about the genesis of the exhibition. Imagine one of the very few nice things of doing the Venice Biennale is that you get to travel around the world, you get to come to amazing places, discover new artists. I could do none of that because, of course, I couldn't travel for about a year. So I basically sat in our apartment, in a little studio, and talked to hundreds and hundreds of artists via Zoom or other platforms, and it was incredibly surreal. Not just now we're kind of used to doing that, but back then it was quite new. But the idea of the complete uncertainty of what was going to happen, you know, many artists lost their studios, they lost exhibitions, there were no exhibitions anymore. So it was, these conversations with artists became almost confessional. They became a bit less about their artworks and their studios, and they became more existential, more, where are we going as a humanity? And, it was, again, a time there was no vaccine for COVID yet. So those conversations really influenced the way I was thinking of the exhibition, and some of the recurring questions that kept coming up were how are the definition of the human changing, what constitutes lives, and what distinguishes human life from natural and non-human life, and what would the world look like without us. And so I try to summarize these questions into three themes that sort of animated the exhibition. Next. The first one was the idea of the metamorphosis of bodies and the representation of bodies, so thinking about how both in art history, but in general, we have represented the human figure. The second one was the relationship between human and technology. And then finally, thinking of a broader spectrum, the relationship between us and the earth. And as I was thinking about these ideas, just to tell you a little bit more about each of them, first of all, in terms of the larger concept of the definition of humans, I was very inspired by post-human thoughts and someone like Rosi Braidotti or Donna Haraway, thinkers that have been really thinking about redefining the concept of human, and especially the centrality of the man at the center of the world and measure of all things. Instead, pushing for an idea of alliances and connections and relationships with other species in a relationship that is not hierarchical, but is one of symbiosis or an equal relationship. And this, let's say, this part of the exhibition also, or this, like, the roots of this exhibition in the post-human thought also led me to the fact that there were a vast majority of women and gender non-conforming artists, because of course when we talk about the centrality of man, of the Cartesian man, very often we also are thinking of a specific kind of man, of a white heterosexual man at the center of the universe, and I wanted to sort of bring in a different view of the world that was not necessarily dictated by that train of thought. The second chapter, or the second sort of theme of the exhibition, was the relationship with technology, and that became also quite important during those months of preparation of the exhibition, because just, I think, you know, in the few years before COVID, we were living in a very sort of exciting moment of, you know, technological evolution, and thinking about how technology could improve our life, our bodies, but at the same time kind of fearing the total takeover of AI and automation. And those kind of, that polarity was there before COVID, but became so evident during the pandemic, in a time in which all of our relationships happened behind a screen or through the membrane of a screen, right? We were just talking to our dear ones via phone or via computer, and at the same time, technology separated us, but also put us closer to each other. So I wanted to kind of reflect on this controversial relationship with technology. And then finally, the idea of the relationship between bodies and earth, and thinking about different forms of localized knowledge and different voices in the, you know, in the vision of the world. Someone that was very important in this part of the exhibition was an Italian philosopher called Silvia Federici, who talks about the idea of the enchantment of the world. Next. This is the entrance. Sorry, I apologize. I have a lot of slides, so I'm going to say next a lot. Next. So this is the first room of the exhibition. As Massimiliano said, the Biennale takes place in two venues. The Central Pavilion, which is what I'm going to show you now. The Central Pavilion is the old, it's a pavilion that was built in 1890, for the 1895 Biennale, the first one. It was a temporary pavilion that was changed many, many times. It's still there. It was built as a temporary pavilion, but it's still there after 127 years. And you can see that because it's kind of falling apart in many parts, but this is the only historical space that is left. This is what the pavilion looked like. It was completely decorated with frescoes. It was a it was a very loaded space, and I wanted to start the exhibition with a very powerful sculpture by a German sculptor called Katharina Fritsch. It's an elephant on top of a pedestal, and so thinking about the first thing that you encounter is not necessarily a representation of a man or a woman or a hero on a pedestal, but it's actually a giant animal on a pedestal that is usually dedicated to the memory of important men. And as she often does, there is always something quite strange about her sculptures, either the scale of them or the color. Next. Oh, actually, can you just go back? Sorry. And so here, in this case, the scale is right. She used an actual mold from a natural history museum, but what's very uncanny is the color. So the elephant is this very dark, surreal green that covers the epidermis of this animal, and so you encounter this strange presence in the most kind of historical room of the exhibition. And elephants are also a sort of matriarchal society. They're led by their females. So I like to start the exhibition with this sort of powerful gesture. Next, the central room of the exhibition sort of encapsulated two of the three themes that I mentioned before, in particular the idea of, you see sculptures in the middle of the room by a Romanian artist called Andra Ursuta. She makes these gorgeous sculptures that are made of glass, and they're cast glass, and they represent bodies that are contorted in metamorphosis, they're changing. Next. Here you can see some details. They're quite exquisite in the making, but they also kind of embody this idea of how our bodies are changing under the pressure of technology and new inventions. Next. Then what you see on the walls are works by Rosemarie Trockel, who is a very important German artist who creates these works that look like abstraction. I like especially these ones because they almost remind you of computer screens or screensavers. They feel very digital, and yet when you get close to them, they're made of wool. They're made of piece like strings or wool. Next. You can't really see them, but those ones on the walls are also, they look like monochromatic paintings, but they're actually made on the loom. And so she's someone that has reflected quite a bit on the idea of, on the assumptions of what we associate with female labor, often thinking about crafts and someone that knits, and these are made with the same materials, but they are made actually with an electronic loom. So again, thinking about conflating two very different sensibilities. Next. One of the sort of exhibition, one of the special things of this edition of the Venice Biennale was the structure of the exhibition. So I wanted the biennial to be, of course, an exhibition of contemporary art, but in a way, that was one part of it. So thinking that most of the biennials, and especially in Venice, like Massimiliano said, often focus on trying to give a snapshot of the global art scene, right? You go, you have all the pavilions, and even the central exhibition often focuses on, a snapshot of what's happening around the world. I thought that could be a sort of, it's an important thing to do as curator, but also it's quite limitative. So I wanted to include moments of reflection that were like historical moments of reflection throughout the exhibitions. I call these moments capsules. They're like historical capsules. They're basically mini exhibition within the exhibition, which brought together, next, only female artists from around the world that reflected on some of the themes of the exhibition, but from a completely different generation and different art historical background. So this is what you're seeing, you can go to the next one too, is the first capsule, which was called The Witch's Cradle, and was taken by one of the title was taken by one of the artists in the show, but it brought together about, I don't know, 30 to 40 artists from the 20th century all through, the end of the 20th century, from very different movements, from surrealism, but also from futurism, from the Harlem Renaissance. And so the idea was to create a constellation of voices that usually you would never see in a contemporary biennial, or you wouldn't see a focus on them. That would kind of be gathered around similar themes of the show. Like in this case, it was very much the kind of grounding presentation that focused on ideas of metamorphosis and fragmentation of the body, like picturing disobedient bodies, bodies that are fractured, beyond dualities of male and female or human and nature. Next. But what was also very important was curatorially to create a very different feeling. Normally when you go to Venice, you see like white spaces, the idea again of the white cube. There are different reasons why you do that, also financially. Usually it's very hard to change the architecture of the show, but I wanted to create these spaces that felt much more intimate. And to do that, I worked with a group of exhibition designers that are called Forma Fantasma, they're Italian, and they really helped me create a different temperature, a different feeling, with the idea that you would enter this time capsule, you would be brought back to maybe the 1920s, and you would learn something that normally you would not see in the context of like a contemporary biennial. It was also a way of thinking of what an exhibition like a biennial can do when it comes to its own history. So the Venice Biennale has been around for 127 years at that point, and as I looked back at many different editions, not just recent but also past, the space that was given to female voices has always been extremely limited. And yet the Venice Biennale has an incredible role in writing art history. So it was a sort of process of looking back at what was excluded from the history of the large art history, but also the history of the Venice Biennale itself, and try to sort of interrogate the centrality of certain history and bring back different voices. Next. So here you see other views. Next. And then, so the idea that you would leave this space, which was within, of course, the kind of exhibition journey, and you would encounter other artists, contemporary living artists, that I wanted to create, to put in context and in dialogue with these historical voices. Sometimes the dialogue was evident, other time was a bit more, alluded to, but I like the idea of compacting this historical voice in one space and then opening up the exhibition with larger installations. Like this was Cecilia Vicuña, who is an artist from Chile. You see the kind of hanging sculptures. She also is the recipient of the Lion for Life Achievement work. She did a piece that was an homage to the Venice Lagoon with things that she found in the lagoon, like just either garbage or pieces of ropes, and then many other artists that sort of shared with her the idea of ecofeminism. Next. This is Miralini Mukherjee, who is an Indian artist, creating, again, thinking about also bringing in methodologies and techniques that are often associated with female labor or female modality, and these are made of ropes that she herself made and dyed herself, but they kind of hover between these sort of abstract totemic shapes and these very figurative, very sensual forms. Next. This is a young Canadian artist who made these sculptures out of tobacco. Next. There is a little garden in the pavilion, which was designed by a very famous Italian architect called Carlo Scarpa, who, and I wanted to sort of bring it back to its original function, which was a sculpture garden, so I displayed a number of figures by Simone Fattal. Next. This is a second capsule inside the central pavilion. It's called Corp Orbit. Next, and it shows, it showcased the sort of works of artists that were affiliated in particular with concrete and visual poetry, so kind of thinking about how language and the act of writing can be a tool for emancipation, so the capsule presented different configurations of language. Next. And we see they feel very different. The first one was extremely warm and almost like a room. This was meant to kind of evoke the color of school tables and desks. Next. And then the show continued with an exploration of both metamorphosis and language. This is the work of an outsider artist called Ovartaci. Next. These are two works that I wanted to sort of put in dialogue. I also tried very often to combine artists from different generations and to ask them to share the same space and create a sort of dialogue that was sometimes forced, imposed by my vision, and other times was more collaborative. Here you see Amy Seelman, who is an American painter, on the walls with this beautiful frieze of abstraction that becomes both bodies, but also almost like a form of language. And then in the center, an artist from South Africa called Browning Katz, who made this kind of abstract, rhythmic sculpture made of mattress springs. Next. This was a large installation by Louis Lawler, who is an American photographer, and this is the sort of top room of the pavilion, and she is someone that has been photographing the works of other artists in unusual contexts, maybe in a storage or in an auction house, and then so you can see the original photos that she took is on this freestanding wall, and then on the walls around she basically stretched the same image to cover all these walls, and to me it was this kind of full abstraction of the body and thinking about how the digital can come in. Next. And then there was a performance that was ongoing in the space by a Romanian artist called Alexandra Pirici, in which 6 dancers all day long would sort of mimic, it was a form of bodily encyclopedia. They would mimic different forms of knowledge with their own bodies. Next. And then the sort of second half of the pavilion continued this idea of figuration, starting from someone more traditional, like Paula Rego, a Portuguese artist who, in a very sort of grotesque style, portrayed very complicated themes, including abortion, but also fairy tales gone wrong. Next. Here you have a young artist called Jana Oehler from Germany, who also sort of expanded that concept. Shurinaya Shuna is an indigenous artist from Canada. Yes, let's continue a bit because I'm worried that we're not having time. So Cristina Carlos, again, you can see how bodies are trying to expand and almost leave the canvas. Next. Until up to almost a complete dematerialization of the body. This is Charlene von Heil, and she's rendering Botticelli's La Primavera in a very digital tone. Next. And then the final part of the exhibition here at the pavilion, you can see that the body is completely gone. It's almost completely dematerialized in this sculpture by Sara Enrico in the foreground, and then on the back, this pixelated vision by Jacqueline Humphreys. Next. The pavilion had one last capsule, which was called Technologies of Enchantment, next, and he showcased the work of 6 Italian artists that belong to the movement called Arte Programmata. Can you advance the slide, please? Yes? Thank you. And so this was a very historical capsule, a historical reflection on a movement like op art in the 1960s that was extremely male-driven, and yet there were 6 incredible artists that were not necessarily part of that official movement, but were working on the intersection of new technology and new materials like plexi and neon lights, with always keeping in mind how to sort of involve the body and the viewer. So many of these surfaces are reflective. You have to actively move in front to see all the optical effect. Next. And here you see contemporary artists also thinking about similar issues. On the very long wall on the back, you see an artist called Ulla Wiggen, who is a Swedish artist, and she in the 1960s created these incredible canvases that are portraits of computers. So imagine it's the rise of new technologies, including computers. She had access to some of the very first computers, and she would actually paint portraits of them, and with all the cables and circuit. And she was like 25 years old, and imagine an extremely masculine environment. And then she stopped working for almost 5 decades until she started making these eyes on the back. They're like hyper-realistic pictures of irises, and in a way she's kind of continuing thinking about the technology by kind of turning the gaze inwards to think about the eyes as our own technology. Next. Next. And here you see the paintings. Next. And then the show keeps going. I'm going to skip here. Next. It becomes colder, and you can see that the body is kind of substituted by metallic surfaces and very cold appliances. Next. Next. And this was the final piece in the pavilion by P. Staff. It was a sort of neon, it was a video piece that looked at bodies in relation also to the agricultural complex. Next. 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 Okay, so now we go to the Arsenale, which you have learned before was the old shipyard of Venice. This is a very challenging space, I think, for curator. You've heard from Massimiliano, who tried to transform it into a temporary museum. I say that because it's a very challenging, it's basically 400 meters long. It's gorgeous, but you're never gonna see it like this. You know, it was like this during COVID because there was no exhibition, but it's a very challenging space. So in the past, curators have tried different ways of breaking this very long linearity of space, and I tried to do something that I thought could work well in the linearity of space, which meant an alternating larger, more, if you like, spectacular presentation with more intimate and personal presentation. So the exhibition started next. With another monumental beginning. The beginnings of both exhibitions were kind of the first thing that I thought about in the show. The Simon Lee piece that you see in the middle was kind of interesting because it came 3 days before the opening, and it was lost on a boat in the ocean. And so, you know, that was one of the effects of COVID, but eventually it made it, and I had this vision of pairing her with the beautiful work of Belki Sayon, who of course you know very well. In the next few slides you can see some different views, and I like to start this with a very different temperature. You can see at this point the exhibition becomes much warmer and almost you will see like ochre tones and earthy tones, but I like to pair these two artists next as artists that have focused on very powerful female figures in their work. Next. And so here you can see, again, the temperature of the show changes completely. It reflects much more on our relationship with the planet and with the surroundings. These are sculptures by a young Argentinian artist called Gabriel Chile. They are vessel forms made of adobe. Next. Here you have another Brazilian artist, Rosana Paulino, depicting kind of magical metamorphosis between the body and plants. Next. A Sami artist called Britta Marakat Labba, who portrayed Sami everyday life. Those are all like embroideries. Next. Niki de Senfal, a pregnant woman, and then what you see behind the Niki de Senfal statue is one of the capsules here at the Arsenale. In the central pavilion, because the pavilion has many rooms, I just transformed some of the rooms into a capsule. Here, it's such a big open space that I had to work with the designer to create a space that felt a bit more intimate. And so in this egg-shaped space, next is the fourth capsule, which is called, has a very long name. It's called a leaf, a gourd, a shell, a net, a bag, a sling, a sack, a bottle, a pot, a box, a container. I wasn't crazy, it was a quote from a book by a philosopher and sci-fi writer called Ursula Le Guin. Next. And then this is what's inside the capsule. So this was a presentation that focused on the form of the vessel or the container. This is why also the shape of it is like an egg. What Ursula Le Guin say in this essay that gives the title to this presentation is that she also goes back to the idea of the birth of technology and what usually is told as the first tool, the first object that the mankind created that was, the weapon that the caveman would use to go out and chase whatever it was that he was chasing. She actually says that that's not true. The very first instrument, the first tool that mankind created was a vessel, was two hands put together, was a gourd, was a leaf that women use to go and fetch seeds and other food stuff for sustaining themselves. And so I really liked this little essay and wanted to use it as an inspiration for a presentation that brought together artists from very different generations that reflected on this idea of the vessel. Of course, the body as a vessel, but also the shape in general. And so you see to the right, Ruth Azawa, who now has become a very celebrated artist from Japan, creating these woven sculptures. Next. And here you have other examples. Next. Like a little bag by Sophie Tauber Arp. This is more than 100 years old. Next. Closed form vessels by Toshiko Takaezu, who was also a Japanese artist. Next. And these were very interesting papier-mâché models of the evolution of a fetus inside an uterus that were used in the 1800s by a woman called Aletta Jacobs, who was the first, apparently, woman that went to university to study medicine and then went on to become a doctor and a teacher and was using these models to explain the anatomy of the female body. Next. And when the show continues, all around these capsules you see contemporary artists engaging with this tradition of the vessel. Next. I'll mention to the right is Pinare Sampitak, who is a Thai artist who reflects on the idea of the offering vessel, but also the breast. And then to the left was a Mexican artist, Felipe Baeza. Next. And then here it's hard to say, but this is one of the largest installations that were also at the Arsenale by Delcy Morelos, who is a Colombian artist who created this basically giant installation made of earth, next, that you could actually enter, next. So here you see from above, it was basically almost like a labyrinth made of soil, and the soil and the earth had lots of spices, both spices and coffee and, you know, cardamom and cinnamon in. So besides having, of course, a visual effect, you would also be struck by the smell and scent of this installation. And all around were Aires Bell, an indigenous artist from Brazil. Next. I'm going to keep going. Next, here you see other installation. This is Emma Talbot. Next. Next. Candice Lynn, who is a young artist from LA. Next. Ali Cherry, okay. And then I'll say a few more words about the last capsules in the show, which was dedicated to the figure of the cyborg, a cyborg as a being that brings together both the human and the machine. Next. So here I turn a large space of the Arsenale into a space that was reflecting on this figure, which the term cyborg was invented in the 60s, but the sort of claim of this presentation was that actually a lot of women artists starting from the 1920s and movement of, you know, both Dada and the Bauhaus were reflecting on the conflation between the body and the machine. Next. Here you see different, so what happened, we painted the floor blue, we created this sort of light box on top and turned the space into a quite cold atmosphere. Next. And then we had these 4 large-scale replicas of photographs of objects that you would see in these vitrines that again conflated these two feelings. Next. Next. I will mention, okay, we can mention the works on the right are by an Estonian artist called Anu Puder, who in the 80s started making these very weird dolls. Again, thinking about Estonia during the 80s, it was a very original work. Next to it, you can see some drawings from the sci-fi movie. It's escaping. No, see? Okay. Sorry. It was from 1924 and had as the main character a woman that you can see here on the right. Next. These were figures made by Lavinia Schulz, who was a German dancer and theater lover who created these large kind of puppets and figures that conflated both elements from nature and from a very mechanical world. Next. Next. And then I'm going to run to the end very quickly. This is next, a large installation by Kapuani Kiwanga. They were like these very large paintings painted on fabric coming from the ceiling with some glass sculptures that thought about the kind of double meaning or significance of sand, both as a material to make glass, but also as a material that is used in the industry of fracking. Next. 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 Okay, we keep going. This is Louise Bonnet. And here, this is Raffaella Vogel. This was either the most loved or hated piece in the show, so I'll let you decide for yourself. It's a sort of, it's a penis, it's an anatomical model of a penis dragged by giraffes. Next. Here you have Mira Lee, who is a very interesting Korean artist that had just opened a big exhibition at Tate in the Turbine Hall. And this was this sort of organism or machine that had both references to the body, but also it was mechanical. There was liquid and fluid moving through the sculpture. Next. This is Sandra Mugillo. Next. And then this is the sort of final stretch with a more kind of sci-fi or robotic feeling. This is Marguerite Humeau, who created these figures that are both quite sci-fi but also very organic. Next. Tishan Su, who is an American artist who, since the 1980s, have really reflected on the interconnection between the body and the epidermis and, the idea of electronics and robotics. Next. And then the sort of long arsenal ends with this installation by Barbara Kruger, who is a very important artist, as you probably know, from the States, who uses language and addresses the audience in a very direct way. Next. I'm going to skip this and just go to the next one. And then I'm going to conclude by just telling you about one of the most challenging installations, which was by an artist called Precious Okoyemon, who is an artist from Nigeria originally. She wanted to transform, the space that you're looking at is exactly the same space that Massimiliano showed you with the Walter de Maria, with the installation of the kind of metal bars on the ground. She decided to turn this space into a garden. And so here you see at the very opening of the exhibition, imagine, to plant a garden in April in Venice is not an easy task because, of course, it's freezing cold up to probably a few weeks before. And so we had to grow plants elsewhere. But the idea was to punctuate this space with these dolls or figures that are made of raw wool. Next. And then you would walk around this space and find yourself in this landscape that had a little water source, a little river. Next. And then started to grow. And the show lasts for 7 months, so every time you come back, it would look completely different. Next. And then the plants that she used had a very specific meaning. She's reflecting on history of colonialism. You can see there is some sugar cane. Next. And then more importantly, next, there is a plant that is called kudzu, which is an invasive plant that is kind of dangerous or forbidden in many places, and it's kind of a vine that grows incredibly fast. So you can see this, the first slide I showed you, the sculptures are kind of gone, are completely kind of taken in. Kudzu has a very, very important story itself. It's a weed that originates from Japan and was imported in the southern United States after, with the idea that it would remediate the soil devastated by the cotton plantations, because that was believed. It was believed to be like a plant that would cure that. Instead, it kind of had the opposite effect. It took over. Sometimes you can see pictures of Louisiana with this vine kind of completely covering all the trees and environment. So she wanted to kind of use this plant also to tell a larger story of colonization, and then bringing it here to Venice, where it took over the entire space. Next. And that was gone. So, and maybe I'll stop just at the slide before this. And yeah, thank you for your patience.
So if anybody has questions, I'm sure everybody wants to leave. Gigi.
Mangia carino.
Hi, so, I hate this. So I have a bunch of questions I have to choose, obviously. But there are things I think that are for both of you in a way. So when you're working already in the spot, like deciding where to place everything, how do you balance between the conceptual and the formal in the exhibition display? You both mentioned that there were things that were very seducing from the visual point of view, but there were other things that were very heavy from the conceptual point of view. Or how do you manage to get to the right point, or at least the point where you think it works for the public? And then, did you actually commission pieces at some point? Because you mentioned that you discuss a lot with artists. So I feel that sometimes there are like pieces that are built for the event. And to which extent do you have an input on that as a curator? You know, the issue between the curator, creator, and the artist being the hands of the curator to an extent. And I think that's a conflict that we might be interested in knowing from your experience. And I do have one last question, if you feel free to answer if you want, that it's for Massimiliano. And so you mentioned, most of the philosophers you mentioned on your presentation are from the Western canon, like if not all of them. To which extent do you believe that Western curatorship as a whole, process is crippled by the Western canon of these philosophers? Because, there is little input from non-Western philosophers, like I'm thinking Latin America, like all the arguments against power and resilience, Mexicans, Cubans, and again, all obviously, Africans, people. So to which extent as a general thing, and just free to answer in the end if you want to. So that's all, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll do a quick answer to your first question. The balance between the conceptual and the formal, I think that's the entire job of a curator. And of course, we condensed here in 40 minutes each. For me, it was a work of 2 years in which I only did this. And so it seems a mechanical thing, but it's the result of a long process of thinking, trying, and discussing with the artists. To me, it was the best way I can describe the job was it's a giant puzzle, it's a tangram. You try to, sometimes I would say to an artist, this is your space. Other times I would tell an artist, I only want that sculpture, that video. So it was very much a balance. It really depended on the artist. I tended not to give carte blanche to an artist because this show was formally and kind of conceptually quite tight. So I didn't want somebody that I liked to present a work that didn't make any sense in the show. So I tried to share as much information as I could with the idea of what I might have wanted. With the large commissions, which I commissioned, like the garden or like the soil piece, I sort of trusted the artist. I knew that I wanted something that spatially would occupy a big chunk of the space. And with Elsie, I knew her practice, but she then came up with a great thing that was this sort of labyrinth. And we talked a lot because it was slightly different from previous installations that she did. And so I think, your job as a curator is also to communicate to an artist how people are going to visit that exhibition. My exhibition was visited by 800,000 people. Imagine everybody stuck their finger in this thing of earth. They really did. And we knew that they would do. And so she kind of changed a little bit the way she makes this sculpture to kind of absorb the impact of the viewer. So again, it's a bit of it's always a discussion, and there isn't necessarily a rule, but because the exhibition is also so gigantic that you use different kind of methodologies.
I'm going to skip the first two because it's probably similar. I don't think there is a manual on how you make shows. I can say briefly, I am a fan of choreographing shows in sometimes in maniacal details, like this was a small selection, but you have to think a show like my Biennale. Also, we should specify one thing. We are talking about the international show, but as you know, the Biennale, and maybe it's the strength and what attracts also so many people is it's composed also of 90 at this point, more or less, national pavilions, of which we didn't show anything because they are not curated by us, they're curated by 90 and plus other, and that's really also the DNA of the Venice Biennale, which makes it special, makes it also still somewhat controversial whether or not notions of nation still mean anything, and goes back to the third question, which I'll get to in a moment. But so I tend to choreograph the shows very much. I literally measure by the centimeter the location of everything. And I try to have a kind of conceptual skeleton, but when making the show, and maybe the fact we call it a show is also problematic but revelatory, in the end, I think if I have to choose between the concept and the image should win, because ultimately the beauty of art is also, and the beauty of working with artists who are, the people that give me the biggest headache, but I love them as much as I hate them. In the end, they are thinking visually, and so for all the concepts I can bring to it, I think in the end, the visual power of the object and the show is somewhat more important, because if anything, it goes beyond words, and I have to respect that, because it's the reason why I go to art every time. And since now we're talking about words, to come to the last question, yes, probably everything I know is biased and constructed within a specific canon and culture. I would be stupid not to be aware of that. On the other hand, it's all I know, and I can say, though, that I would never use the word crippled for thinkers, because with all their limits, people like Régis Debray or Hans Belting or Marc Auger and many others, at least they taught me something. So they didn't cripple me. They actually gave me crutches and sticks and prosthetics to walk with. And yes, their views is partial, but when you have mentors or references that are healthy, they also teach you to doubt your own ideas and your own limits, and I think all those thinkers have done so. So, of course, I am guilty of partiality. They are biased, but they're all very much healthy thinkers in the sense they never pretended they held the truth and all the answers. My show was a show about knowledge and this myth of the universal knowledge, but he was certainly skeptical about it, and that is from both Auriti to Jan Vo and many artists. They all were proving the impossibility of that universal knowledge. So I think it was a big caveat, a big question also, a provocation also towards the Biennale and towards any ambition to the universal, which we all know doesn't exist, or more problematic, it's built on very partial and often violent suppression of other points of views. I don't know if that answered the question.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, it's interesting because it's also happening here, and I do understand, I do get that your references as an European are those thinkers. What conflicted me is that non-European curators also use those references instead of local references or regional thinkers. And the other issue with that, it's with discussion I had at home the other day, and it was that these people were theories over the last 50 years, give or take, and in the last 30, we haven't seen anybody that interesting and that, what's the word? Insidious on reality as, Auger, Debray, Le Breton, you name them. So it's interesting to see that there haven't been any new theories, any new thinkers, any new philosophers to the reach of these people, to the point of these people. I mean, I know there are a lot of thinking in Latin America. I mean, my mom does that. she does. So we're very much talking about that all the time. So that for me is interesting to get your perspective, because I know the one I have at home.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't want to, also I want to hear from others, but one could say, actually now in American academia, there is a whole different interest in, let's call it the post-colonial, which paradoxically becomes, I think if there is something in the history of biennials that can be instructive, is everything sooner or later ossifies into a canon. And now probably we are in a canon of the post-colonial, and so maybe we should look elsewhere to criticize that. And by saying that, I don't mean that, for heaven's sake, the contribution of the post-colonial are not valid, but I think also from artists we need to learn to constantly look elsewhere, and that is an expansion that is healthy.
I'm also a little bit tired of decolonial and calling everything decolonial when they're not.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I totally agree with you.
There were some questions here. I think does he need to use the microphone? Or?
I wanted to know the name of the book you mentioned about the role of art in religion and ideology.
Yeah, I think it's called The War of Images. I don't remember if it's called The War of Dreams or The War of Images by Marc Auger. But the other one that was much more influential in a way for me is The Life and Death of Images by Régis Debray. Oh. There are some here and one there. Sure. Si la puede preguntar en español, vamos a...
Suave, en el micrófono, hablando despacio.
Gracias. Cecilia.
Thank you. Cecilia, my question is for you. It seems interesting that you talk about non-professional artists. What was the quality that made you include them in such an important biennial as the one you curated? What was your approach to that type of artist? Thank you.
Thank you. In the exhibition that I curated, I would say maybe Massimiliano focused much more on the so-called outsider or self-taught artists. I did have some of them. That was not necessarily the focus in the capsules that I brought in Venice. What I tried to focus on was a dialogue between different mediums and different disciplines. So I had lots of poets or writers or artists in a very wide definition, like not necessarily visual artists. And that is something that I really love to do, and I've done before in other exhibition. Even, the idea of the way I got to this book, because I was looking for a title for the exhibition, and I often start by reading artists' writings. So to find inspiration, and she was not just an amazing artist, but she was an exceptional writer who wrote novels and short stories, and then I eventually got to this little kind of children's book. So to me, what I'm interested in curatorial practice is to bring in different voices that are not necessarily visual artists, and that's something that happened very much in Venice. I would say maybe for a more less conventional visual artist, I'll pass it to Massimiliano, because his focus was very much on self-taught artists.
Yeah, and there is no rule. in Germany, when I did the Berlin Biennale, they always asked me what the criteria for the selection of artists were, and I always joke that, I don't choose my friends or my companion or lover with criteria. I think if anybody, chooses people with criteria, it's usually a psycho killer. So, there are no, it's an adventure where you share so much when you work on an exhibition, so there are no rigid criteria. What I do look for, the only way in which I can describe it is intensities, which I don't know exactly how to express it. I try, and the Venice Biennale and the Gwangju Biennale and other shows I've done were a learning process for me. I try to get rid of notions of quality because I think they're very restrictive. So as I say earlier, the German artist Thomas Hirschhorn always says quality no, energy yes. I look for intensities. I look for things that should have an unconventional, trembling quality. Well, I say quality again, so I guess I don't free myself. A mixture of originality, strangeness, focus actually maybe I look for individualities. So, something that is so individual to appear mysteriously like you and different from you. And, some might call that quality, but to me is a bit more, quality is established by rules that are made from others, and what I think is intensities are self-established, no? And, but that's how I explain it to myself. Ultimately, maybe it's just personal taste, but that's how I go through it in my mind.
And I just add one thing is, I think the inclusion of different voices is not something that pleases us. I think there is something for the other artists in the exhibition that is so exciting to maybe be juxtaposed to someone that comes from a different field, or that, someone that they don't know and they can actually learn from. And the same goes for the viewer, the idea that you can enter a space and actually learn about an amazing poet that comes from Brazil that you never heard before and you would never expect in a sort of visual art exhibition. I think that's, of course, like I imagine it as a gift to the audience as well. Other questions? Or we can go for lunch.
Yeah, you want the microphone?
Sí.
Bueno, mi pregunta.
My question is a little bit more simple than the prior questions. My question is, did you have links with blowing glass artists in Venice or in any other place, and have you linked or included them in your curatorial work?
Cosa?
Es que yo...
In my show, there was it's an interesting question because, Venice is so much about that I guess we maybe get a little snobbish about it and we don't focus on that. In my show, there was a beautiful film by an artist named Melvin Motti that looked at blown glass, in his case from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and he looked at them as they were planets almost. For me it was very interesting because he was looking at these fragile, small objects, but he was looking at them so close, he was making them float and looking them very, very close and projecting them extremely large, that it was like he was looking at the cosmos. And so I very much like this idea of a small object that it can be as complex and rich as as the universe. And obviously, when it comes to glass, the alchemy, as maybe the Kapwani Kiwanga piece makes evident, the simplicity and complexity of something that is sand and fire and silicio.
Silica.
Silicio, I guess, is as ancient as the universe itself, and yet in constant transformation. I think was particularly relevant in a show that looked at so-called personal cosmologies, the ability of making your own vision of the universe.
In Venice, I don't have a picture, but there was an artist called Virginia Overton, whose work is very different normally. But in Venice, she made buoys. Buoys, boa, floating in the sea to mark in glass. Because in Venice, back in time, they were made of glass, and they were beautiful pink floating buoys that she made there, and then there was a mesh all around it. But it's interesting because most of the artists that I've worked with are using cast glass now, not blown. So cast as a like Andra Usuta, very, very complicated, much more complicated than blown glass. But yes, Virginia did the blown glass, but it's a great technique.
Other questions? Over there.
Hi, my name is Memphis. I'm a student from the United States. I'm kind of really interested in the use of the term kitsch. I can't help but think of my own research, which is about American football teams that collect art and display them in their stadiums, which isn't to say that I'll call the art in the stadiums kitsch. But I will say that by putting the art in the stadiums, it changes the context of the work. And so I'm interested if you think that by placing this art that may not have been considered art specifically before, or wasn't created with that intention, and putting it in a space like the Venice Biennale changes the context of it and maybe either elevates the status of it or even changes the context in which it's created. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know, you want to go first? I mean, obviously around the word kitsch, there is a vast bibliography that would keep us busy another afternoon. Personally, on one hand, I think the greatest, and now I use a terminology I wouldn't like to use, but I'm contradicting myself. The greatest artists are the ones that demolish accepted notions of taste. To use two guys, Warhol and Picasso are the two grinding machines that dissolve any traditional notion of taste. Famously, or it's unclear if it was spurious or not, but Picasso said that taste is a problem that is best left to ice cream makers, no? And he said that with great contempt, saying taste is a problem of superficial understanding of art, and so he set out to destroy taste. Duchamp himself compared taste to feces, etc., etc. So it's a problem that is central to the notion of contemporary art, not to fight against good taste and propriety, etc., etc. Obviously, many of these notions are sociologically built, as we know, and as also we know, moving context often provokes friction between expectations and between taste. So, yes, I think in my show, one of the criticisms that maybe goes back to the gentleman who asked earlier is, that the curator wants to become an artist and is somewhat appropriating non-art objects to claim a kind of artistic role for himself or herself. It's a problem I pose myself a lot, and because I don't like to be in that position, and the way in which I get around that problem took me a while, and it was really by understanding that exhibitions could be bigger than art in a way. And paradoxically, it's something I learned from artists like Jeremy Deller or Robert Gober, Rosemary Trokel herself, who have been amazing exhibition makers. And from them, I learned that if you expand the notion of exhibition beyond art, they become more interesting. And by that I mean they can teach us things about life, as grand as it sounds. They can teach us how to approach images critically. They can become more about how we establish hierarchies. I myself, until really I did the Gwangju Biennale, I had a kind of agonistic idea of exhibitions. I thought, in exhibitions we show the greatest artists and we show the greatest artworks. And it took me a while to, understand how stupid and limited that idea was. And I freed myself in a way by opening up exhibitions to things that are non-art, because paradoxically, I think we learn more about ourselves, we learn more about how taste is constructed, they become potentially more interesting to analyze how images are used, how value is created, et cetera, et cetera. So the temptation of being an artist, I think, is bypassed because I don't think that anything in my shows is art. Everything is something else, which I would describe as more broadly as images rather than art. I don't know if that answered the question. No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Sí, bueno,
Thank you very much. Just a curiosity, some of those non-artists after that exhibition became artists?
I don't know. What I would love more is the famous paradox: did the artwork stop being artworks? That would be more interesting to me. I think, to answer your question practically, some artists, or some, like Shiniki Sawada, who is this autistic sculptor, who works basically in a hospital or in a commune that is supervised by a hospital, certainly was not recognized as a professional artist. After the inclusion in the Biennale, he is recognized as an artist. He sells things, etc., etc. I'd be more curious and in a way more excited if professional artists were looked at less as professional artists after the show, which I don't know if it's true. The famous paradox, the Marcel Duchamp provocation is, can you use a Rembrandt as an ironing board? No? And is he still a Rembrandt or not? That I don't know. But I think it's healthy, going back to the question also, decolonialize, it's healthy to take artworks off the pedestal, particularly in an economy like New York or where so much of the thinking is about prices. Roger Calois once goes to Korea and he says he goes to the museum and he says that people bow in front of the Buddha in the museum, and he says how beautiful. They are not looking at it as an artwork, they're looking at it as Buddha. And I think that's a freeing experience if you can look at the same object both as an artwork and a non-artwork. And so I think, to answer your question, some people that were not artists became artists, but I would be more excited if some artworks stopped being artworks that we revere for their financial value, and we started thinking of them more for their ideas. I don't know if you have... That's it. Thank you.
I was saying, or you were, maybe the exhibition with the Encyclopedic Palace should have other editions particularly Latin America had a good special weight. To what extent Mario Pedrosa, Nirla Cerveira, for example, Mario Cervosa is an example of the connection between international art. He worked with the big international art masters, or maestros, sorry, and after that, he played a very important role in boosting other young artists that became very great artists. So I think doing a museum with Nida Silveira on the unconsciousness or the art brute, and Reina also made a very re-evaluation of the famous Catalonian psychiatric who was in exile during the Republic. There are people that not only rebelled using art, but also rebelled in terms of in psychiatric terms, and saw this as a collective therapy. This is something very interesting. Maybe this exhibition is still lacking that could cover everything that has happened up to now. I thought should say or advise you about this. And you have been including artists from different regions. This began with Harold Seaman in the 1980s with a very important change in the Venice Biennial. But I think that after that, your exhibitions having Edward gave or highlighted the African art, and I think art history is permanently being rewritten. And you also mention the role of the curator, which is very complex. Harold himself said sometimes curators have to nail things, set the artwork, and that is very interesting. In fact, in the biennials that I organized, we talked about the term curator or curating. It's like if the artwork is ill. Spaniards say commissioner. It's like the artwork needs a police. So we have a text by Boris Groy that talks about the installation policy, who talks about this. Caroline also questioned this and documented it. But there are still two questions. Well, there are many questions. We know who the artists are, but we don't know what art is. Art has tensed everything, less the artist, except the artist. Once the artist is dissolved within the community, art will become totally eradicated. And when curatorial processes can become institutions that can do this in communities, etc. So we thank you very much for being here, crossing all seas, geographical seas, political seas, affectionate seas. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the exchange. Thank you.
directora general del Centro Multimedial del Ministerio de Juventud te va a comunicar para llevarte allá. ¿Oíste? Tú me dijiste que te vas cuando este sábado.
No, el miércoles.